How do we change the world? Every movement at some point has asked itself this question. And usually there are two paths ahead. On the one hand, there is the path of slow, gradual reform, mostly through the economic and political institutions. On the other side, there is the path of uncompromising principles and some form of revolution, even if this is just a revolution of ideas. Two towering intellectual figures, Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand, personify these different paths. For Milton Friedman, the way towards more freedom is through gradual reforms, through using tools of economics and tools of policy in terms of bringing more freedom to the choices and the decisions of everyday people. But for Ayn Rand, the solution would have to be a battle of ideas. The solution would have to be a change on the level of how people understand morality, and the change had to be more radical. So these different paths and which one could bring us closer to a change towards more freedom is a topic of today's New Idea Live of the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. And with me today is Onkar Ghate. So Onkar, recently there was a new biography of Milton Friedman by Jennifer Barnes. And reading it, I found it fascinating that almost in living memory, perhaps the most influential and the most prominent economist in the world was someone who was actually advocating for more markets and for more capitalism. Milton Friedman was someone who had on his speed dial chairman of the Federal Reserve, presidents of the United States. He was someone who won the Nobel in economics. And also, he was someone who, through his TV series Free to Choose, had the equivalent of what today we'd call a popular Netflix series. Millions of people watched him advocate for free enterprise. So, in my mind, Friedman sounds like a model of a successful public intellectual. But what do you think, Onkar? What is your overall evaluation of Friedman, his life, and his work?
You said he's a model of a public intellectual. I think that's true. You described a little bit about how prominent he was at the height of his career, and it's both an academic career, and he's known in the academic world and became known outside the academic world in terms of public policy and as a public intellectual. So I think from that perspective, you can say it's a successful career. I overall have a positive view of Friedman. I'm not an expert in his work and all his academic economic work. So this is more looking at it from a public intellectual's perspective. That overall, I think he's a positive influence on the direction of ideas and policy that is being implemented but primarily, I'm thinking primarily of the United States. You could have hoped for something better, and there's reasons you could have expected something better than him. We can talk a little bit about Ayn Rand's view of Milton Friedman a little bit later, but I think that's relevant to understanding so I think like he's a positive. He could have been better than what he is, but that doesn't change the fact that he is essentially, I think, a positive influence. He's one of the people, here includes Ayn Rand, who helps bring back discussion of free markets and of capitalism and of thinking that, oh, maybe we should try that again. So in terms of thinking of the direction of the United States, if you know in the 60s, 70s, it's turning very collectivistic, socialistic. There's incredible new government programs. I mean, really starting from the New Deal with Roosevelt onwards, but more and more government control and intervention in the economy. And he, along with someone like Ayn Rand, Frederick Hayek, there's some pushing, well, maybe we should try something different. And maybe what we need is not more government controls, but fewer government controls. and inflation was a big issue in the 70s into the 80s. He's important as one of the voices saying inflation is a monetary phenomenon. It's because of government printing money to try to pay for its spending and debts. It's a form of devaluing the currency if we want to get inflation under control. That's what we have to focus on. As against, if you think early in the 70s, Nixon, it's, inflation's a problem. We're going to have price controls, and the government's going to set all the prices or major prices in the economy. Here, it's a big shift to think, no, that's just a symptom, prices going up, and you can't address inflation by trying to tell people just, no, you can't charge a higher price and so on. You have to address the source of it. So there's many aspects where he's pushing that is advocating ideas that are important and that are a move away from further government controls.
And something else that I find to his credit is he's one of the very few people that as he grew older, he became more, let's put it, radical. So Friedman in the 30s, he's more of a mainstream when it comes to his economics. He votes for FDR. And then as time goes by, he gets more and more and more persuaded about the merits of more freedom. Initially economic freedom, but later in his life, he also talks about he puts more emphasis on political freedom. But now, let us see the three main pillars in Friedman's thought when it comes to change the culture towards more freedom. So we will not enter today into details about his economics, but let's see his three pillars, his three tenets, his three main lines as a public intellectual. The first central point in Friedman, the public intellectual, is pragmatism and utilitarianism. And these are terms that he would use proudly about himself. He would say there are two kinds of libertarians, as he would call people who care about freedom. He says, on the one hand, there are the extreme libertarians, and he gave us an example, Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand wouldn't accept the title, but it helps us understand what Friedman means. And he said, extreme libertarians have this deontological defense of freedom. They think freedom is this principle, and we start from the principle, and the principle guide our action. But Friedman says there's also a different type, and he called himself a consequentialist. So his line was, don't give me values and principles, go out, measure things, and tell me what works. If freedom works, then we want more freedom. So this is how he sees himself. Now, what is an example of Friedman approaching things in this way? The draft. Friedman was one of the main reasons, one of the main influences for stopping the draft. So during the Nixon days, and also through the impact of a person who was actually close to Ayn Rand, someone called Anderson, they too were the biggest influences on Nixon in campaigning against the draft. Now, what is very interesting was that Friedman did not use at all the individual rights argument against the draft, which would be the obvious defense, that if I have to be drafted, it's like the state is kidnapping me for whichever period of time, and actually it's sending me to fight a war that I might not want to fight. Friedman does not use this argument. Friedman says that if we measure the numbers, we see that actually a voluntary professional army is cheaper than the army of people who are there based on the draft, for people who are not professionals, people who are not paid. And someone could say, and it actually worked. His approach worked because indeed the draft was eliminated based on this influential work by Friedman. So, Onkar, let's take each one of his points one at a time. So, point number one, pragmatism, utilitarianism, show me that freedom works, show me the numbers.
If we go back to what the initial question is that we're looking at here and that you want to talk about, we can put it reform or revolution. And as what's the solution? Well, it depends on what the problem is to know what the solution is. I don't think it's for every problem, revolution's the solution. And I don't think for every problem, reform is the solution. So a lot depends on how one is thinking about the problem. And part of what is very different about Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman is how they're thinking of the problem. So if you think of it just at a political level, that there's growing power of the state, growing control of by the U.S. government. And again, I'll make the focus here on the U.S. And here, when you're talking about the draft, you're talking about the draft in the U.S. It's government control over the economy, but more broadly over people's lives. Growing government control, and what has led to that, and so how do we fight that? Milton Friedman is much more conventional in how he thinks about the problem. And the solution then will be much more reform, because people basically agree on the ideas and the approach. They're wrong about how they're executing it. And so here, if you're telling, well, so you can think of it like the contrast for the draft is, well, you think the most efficient, cost-effective form of having a military is having a draft. I'm going to show you, no, it's actually if we had a volunteer army. And so on that kind of argument is on your own premises. That is telling the person you're talking to or arguing with, on your own premises and viewpoint, you should accept this and reject your that there's a draft. The more you think, no, what they're wrong about their very premises, their overall framework of how they're looking at things, the more you can't make that kind of argument. You're just reinforcing their wider premises, more abstract ideas, and by not challenging them, you're reinforcing them. That was Ayn Rand's view, that what the problem was radically incorrect ideas, including moral ideas. And so you had to challenge those, not say, okay, well, you're basically right, but let me show you sort of in terms of execution, you're going wrong. That doesn't mean it's revolution without reform. I think Ayn Rand was interested in both. So, and in many of these, whenever you're presented with an either or, so it either has to be this or, one question you should always ask, why can't it be both? And particularly if you find something attractive on both sides, that question you should always ask, why can't it be both? And so now get to the draft. Ayn Rand argued both. Ayn Rand argued that in terms of the individual rights, in terms of the very nature and ideals of the American form of government, if you take the Declaration of Independence seriously, the government is our servant. It can't order us around, much less tell us, oh, okay, for the next 2 years, we're telling you everything you're going to do, how you're going to live your life. And if we decide you have to go fight in some foreign land like Vietnam, we're going to just send you and you have no choice about the matter. That makes a mockery of the Declaration of Independence. That's part of what Ayn Rand argued. But part of what she argued, so she rejects this whole consequentialist versus deontological as, again, there's a choice of, you either have abstract ideas that have no foundation in observation and evidence, or you go by observation and evidence without abstract ideas. And in terms of morality, it becomes the deontologist is the person who has moral views. Like, we know there should be individual rights. Why there should be, I don't know. It just comes from up on high, or it comes from a duty that we figured out in our own minds, without any connection to reality, to observations, to experience. That's how a deontology is thought about. It's a list of duties that come. It's basically a secularized view of religion. Instead of the 10 commandments literally coming from God, you've got some kind of 10 duties that come from who knows where, that's what you're supposed to follow. And the consequentialist is, in effect, a reaction that, well, I'm not doing that. I'm not just following a list of duties because someone said, so I'm just going to figure out what I should do in each situation, and I'm going to abandon principles, because what a principle looks like is something divorced from reality, like a set of duties coming from who knows where. Ayn Rand's view was, no, individual rights are a set of principles, but they come from reality and your observations of reality. And therefore, if you respect rights, your country and the people in the country will do well. And if you don't, you'll have all kinds of problems. And so she did argue that the draft is a bad form of government. And we can see that in the actual experience with the draft of countries that have the draft. She viewed something like the Vietnam War, which she was against, but not for the reasons of the of who people now think of the anti the Vietnam War, of the people who are on the side of communism and so on. Of but she was against the war because she thought it was not in America's self-interest, and she thought only if you have a draft can you have a war like this that nobody wants. The soldiers don't want to go to it. If they had a choice in regard to it, they wouldn't enlist to go fight in Vietnam. And the ones who did could do that, and the ones who were against it wouldn't have to do that. And that's part of why you don't want to draft. It's a violation of rights, and therefore it's bad for foreign policy. It can get us enmeshed in something like Vietnam that would have been impossible absent the draft. So she's looking at both the principles and the experience, and the principles should come from the experience, and then they should guide further, like your further actions, your further experience. That's what a principle is on her perspective. And so that's not the way Friedman is thinking about it, and particularly in regard to morality. He's conventional. So you said pragmatism, and that I was talking more about the pragmatism. The utilitarianism is, from Ayn Rand's perspective, utilitarianism is what is responsible for the decay of capitalism, for why we moved away from the Declaration of Independence to what one saw in the 70s. So if you think of like over a century of the American experiment, utilitarianism is the problem. So she's not going to think, oh, if you can reform and activate utilitarianism, it's the problem. And we can talk about why it's the problem, but that's such a major difference in the two of them.
So first pillar of Friedman, as you said, pragmatism, utilitarianism. Another pillar is how he views change. He views change through small, gradual reforms. And now, Onkar, you mentioned that sometimes this dichotomy, reform or revolution, is a false dichotomy. But I think there is an important question, which is, what is your end goal? So it's never clear with Friedman, what is his end goal? For example, does he consider that taxation is a violation of our rights? Does he believe that the welfare state, then what in the UK they call the nanny state, intervening in people's life, is it that it's a violation of rights, or is it that it does not work? And if we see his trademark policy, which was what today would call universal basic income, in Friedman's words, negative income tax. In simple terms, Friedman says, let's get rid of most welfare programs and just give cash to people. So if you make below a particular amount of money, if your income is below a particular threshold, we will make up from this threshold by giving you money. And his explanation is, this is a system which is less intrusive, which means the dignity of the recipient is intact, because instead of having a social worker intervening in your life, you just receive a text. But also, he says, it is more predictable for the person who pays. You know that you have to pay this tax. This tax is more or less the same. And this is also an argument that Hayek makes, that if an intrusion by the state is a predictable intrusion, then it is okay. So for Friedman, the goal, it seems to me, is not to get rid of the welfare state, although he says that at some point he wants that. It is to make the welfare state more efficient. And the more I think about it, Onkar, the more I realize that we're going back to the first principle of the pragmatism utilitarianism principle, that the welfare state doesn't, quote, work, and therefore here is something that, quote, works. And of course, as a transitioning measure, the negative income tax, in my view, is much better than the existing welfare state. But the question is it a transition for Friedman? Does Friedman have an end goal? We never found this out. So second key theme in Friedman: gradual change, reform.
Yes, and you said like that connects to the first issue, and I think you can see it in spades here. If what you're saying is we need to make the welfare state more efficient, but you're not talking about and talking about in detail what is wrong with the welfare state as such, then what you end up doing is you're reinforcing the basic principle of the welfare state. And I'll just put it in Marxist terms, because this, though this is associated with Marx, it's much wider than Marx. From each according to his ability to each according to his need. That's the basic premise of the welfare state. That if you have someone in need, suffering, in dire straits, it doesn't matter the reasons why, other people are on the hook. They're morally responsible for bailing that person out. And if they don't do their fulfill their moral responsibility or do their moral duty, the government exists to make them do it. And so the welfare is taking from people who've produced, from people of ability, and giving it to people who haven't produced, to people who are in need. And if you think of that as, well, that's proper, that's good, that's moral, then the implications of that, whether you like it or not, and whether you're going to be like Friedman and try to resist all the implications is government should do this when and if necessary. And if you look at the expansion of the welfare state in America, the arguments are, well, it's necessary here and it's necessary there. It's necessary in education. There's a lot of people who want an education, would do well with an education. They can't afford an education. We have to have public schools so that everybody is educated. And then it's, well, in retirement, we see a lot of people in need. And so why shouldn't the government be helping people in retirement? Don't we need something like Social Security? And what about healthcare? We see a lot of people in need there. So maybe the government should be involved in Medicaid. So it's not a kind of a grandiose vision of socialism, but it's on each particular, it's like we find people in need and there's other people who have ability and are producing. So why shouldn't they be giving more to the people in need? And if they don't do it voluntarily, well, we need coercive programs like Social Security and Medicaid and so on. And that's what happened. So that you might be able to fight some excesses and that people view as excesses in the short term. But long term, if what you're saying is, I'm going to make the welfare state more efficient, you're legitimizing the welfare state. And so the gradual, and you put it like, what is the end point? What's the goal? What's the final destination? And if it's not elimination of the welfare state, if it's to make it more efficient, and if that's how people see it and hold it, then you're reinforcing the welfare state. And Ayn Rand was adamant whenever she proposed things that she thought were better but not ideal, to say what the ideal was. So she wouldn't have been for a negative income tax, but she has an article, Tax Credits for Education, that this is better than the public schools. But she still thought like government should not be involved in education at all. There should be a separation of education and state, like church and state. And she made clear that's the destination. This is a means towards it, but only good if we continue headed towards that destination. And I think that's the difference between reform in the context of, I think the overall system is okay, or advocating reforms while simultaneously saying the overall system is wrong.
Yeah, it's the difference between, maybe negative impact tax, negative income tax makes sense as a transition until, let's say, we phase out this movement. But Friedman never said that again. He did not tell us where we're heading up. And people who think that we might be a bit harsh on Friedman, people, go check the document, the series Free to Choose, and notice something. Whenever Friedman talks about not only the welfare state, but also the welfare state, the people who run the welfare state, the bureaucrats, the social workers, he goes out of his way every single time to remind us that these people have good intentions. And my question is this: if these people have good intentions, and if this is a well-meaning program, then maybe we should try time and again to fix it. And if it didn't work this, maybe it's a bit like socialism. It didn't work this time, but if we agree that it's a good idea, as many people do, then why not try again? So Friedman never, ever actually questions the morality of the welfare state. And there's another thing that he fails to do. 10 episodes of Free to Choose. I watched it recently, and it's in my memory. Every single time when he criticizes the welfare state, he talks about what it does to the recipient. So he goes to Manchester, he goes to one of these monstrous social housing blocks, and he tells us that people there are demotivated. Only in passing, in 10 episodes, does he mention, I think, once or twice that, by the way, these are someone else's money. So for Friedman, the problem is not that some people have to pay for the recipient. It's not that some people bear the duty that a particular percentage of their time is dedicated to someone else without these givers having chosen this. For Friedman, the main problem is the recipient. And now someone could ask Onkar, could say, look, you're a bit harsh on him. He's on Prime TV. So maybe I'm putting you on the spot, but would you actually go on Prime TV and say, you know what, you don't have a right on my money? So Friedman would think, you're not going to persuade anyone, therefore the way I'm doing it is more persuading. Would you have an answer to that?
Yes, I think you do go on TV. This is what you see Ayn Rand do when she's on Johnny Carson or Phil Donahue. When she goes on TV, you have to put the point in its radical terms that you don't have a right to the productive people's money because they're productive. I mean, that's all over Atlas Shrugged. So Ayn Rand is a moral radical, a moral challenger. And the fact is, that's what is needed, and many people respond to it. And it's part of why Ayn Rand is a best-selling author, and Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead are best-selling authors. If you think in terms of The Fountainhead, I came here to tell you that you don't own 1 minute of my life. That's part of the courtroom speech in The Fountainhead. And when people hear that, there's something really right about that. They have a sense that the moral atmosphere is the moment you're successful, productive, that, as Ayn Rand would often put it, that creates a mortgage on your life that you owe other people now. And it's not the American system. It's not what individualism is. And it's not what a proper conception of morality would tell you. So she's a more radical and a moral challenger. And so one is, in terms of, if the problem is we're in the grips of an evil morality, and a simple way to hold what an evil morality is, it tells you things that are evil, it tells you they're good, and things that are good, it tells you they're evil. And if you take this is what Atlas Shrugged is about. The Ayn Rand is as the champion in history of the businessman and the entrepreneur. Part of it is, Atlas Shrugged is like, we've been told the conventional view is businessmen are evil. And the proper moral assessment is not just, oh no, they're sort of morally neutral. They're in their capacity as creators, entrepreneurs, the creators of big business, of industry, they're moral giants. And she's really saying that our moral views are the opposite of the truth. So, and if that's your diagnosis of the problem, then you have to be a radical in terms of morality to push the solution. But if that diagnosis of the problem is right, other people can see it. So the question was about, can you convince other people? Yes, if you make the arguments. And part of the reason Ayn Rand talked in essay after essay about altruism and why it's evil and what it does and how it plays out is people have to see it. But when they see it, they'll be able to grasp, there's something radically evil here, and we need a very different view. You have to convince people of that, but and it's possible, and there's no shortcut. Was, I think, Ayn Rand's view.
Right. And the third point of the third theme of Friedman is that change comes through economics, through sound economics, and through policy making. So one of the lines that is sums up how he viewed his job as an intellectual is the following quote. He says, "That I believe is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." So create alternative politics, and today they might sound impossible, but soon they will be inevitable. The obvious example here is his monetary policy against to combat inflation. In the 60s, Friedman was mocked. In the 60s, he was ignored. In the 80s, this became his flagship, let's say, contribution to change in American policy. And you mentioned something, Onkar. You mentioned Ayn Rand's praise of the big businessman, let's say, or the businesswoman. For Friedman, big business is suspicious. For Friedman, anything which is big government, big labor, but also big business is suspicious. And this is another reason why he focuses in policy changes. And he wants to make sure that we need policies that will make sure that no one is going to have too much power. So he makes this misunderstand. He has this misunderstanding that many people have, that big business has power, big government has power. Let's make sure that they both have less power, without realizing that the only quote power that big business might have is granted as a privilege or as a monopoly by the government. And if we understand what power means, only the government has power. But anyway, this is a parenthesis. Any comment on his focus on economics and policy change? And one more thing, someone might say, what are you talking about? Friedman was an educator. He went on public TV talking about freedom. Yes, he went on public TV, but he educated almost entirely on these two things, on economic education and on policy issues. Again, go watch Free to Choose. There are 10 episodes. In one of these episodes, he mentions Thomas Jefferson. Every other episode has to do with economic issues, such as education vouchers, planning laws, rules that have to do with health and safety, and things like that.
I don't want to diminish the importance of economics and take something we talked about and something brought up again now, combating inflation. It was important to get a better view of the nature, causes, and consequences of inflation than what existed in the 60s and early 70s. And Friedman is one of the people advocating for a better view. Now, there's disagreement about, say, the Austrians and what would be called the Chicago School of which Friedman will be a major representative of, how they fully think about inflation, the causes, and then should you have a central bank? What should it do? So there's disagreements, but that broadly, it's a monetary phenomenon caused by government manipulation of the monetary supply. That's the kind of school or viewpoint that Friedman has, that the Austrian people like Hayek and Mises have. That's how you have to think about it. And it's important, and it was important for the country, and that inflation was tamed into the 80s. And then you see, 2 decades or more of greater prosperity, greater economic growth in America. That's important. So it's not as though economic issues are not important. But if one's thinking about full change in direction of the culture, it's one issue. It's not the most significant issue. Political and philosophical issues shape everything. They form the basic framework in which even something like economics is looked at. And Friedman, I think, he's pretty conventional in political theory, if you think of it like that, instead of economics. and political organization, and philosophically, he's incredibly conventional. And this kind of view that everybody has the same goals, everybody's basically good. You brought up like the bureaucrats and so that everyone is after the same thing. It's again just the means that people are disagreeing with. And if we could get people to understand the more efficient means to the goals everybody agrees on, that's too much. Like that's what economic does. That's the thinking about it. And economics will teach you how to be more efficient in your means towards these same goals. And it's completely wrong. And let me give it something at the more abstract level and then the more concrete level. You brought up about thinking about bureaucrats and things like that. Take that second. The Declaration of Independence versus utilitarianism. These are radically different conceptions of the goal. It's not the people who are on the side and understand. So the people who wrote the Declaration, they're not utilitarians. They disagree with utilitarianism. It doesn't exist as a kind of formal doctrine that it would have been at the tip of their tongues, as it does in the 20th century. Everybody knows utilitarianism. But the Declaration of Independence is the individual has a right to the pursuit of his or her own happiness, your own individual happiness. Utilitarianism is not individualism, it's collectivism. The goal is a collective goal, a greatest happiness for the greatest number. And if a particular individual, their happiness doesn't matter, or if you sacrifice it, and that will supposedly achieve the greatest happiness for other people, that's what you should do. And utilitarianism tells you this. And one of the kind of main spokesmen and developers of utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, tells you this explicitly, that this is what it's about. And I'm not making reference to rights, which means to individual rights. So these two, like, they're radically different conceptions of the goal. And to think of it as just, oh yeah, these people agree morally. Like the Jefferson, who helps write the Declaration of Independence, and John Stuart Mill, well, they're in basic agreement. They're not in basic agreement philosophically, morally. So that, and for Friedman to just gloss that over is he doesn't understand classical liberalism at a philosophical level, and that there's different approaches that are, one might think of, well, John Stuart Mill and Thomas Jefferson are both on the side of freedom, but they're not if you understand the fundamentals of the viewpoint.
And
Take now at
Friedman,
a more go ahead, sorry.
Oh yeah, just to say also that he was almost snobbing the philosophical importance of freedom, and he did this consciously. So quite often you see him in an interview, someone asks him a question which is actually a deeply philosophical question, such as, don't you think that we have a duty, for example, to other people? And he might say, no, but then he returns to the practical argument. So I think deep in his heart, he would, if you ask him, hey, don't you agree that each one of us our life is an end in itself? We are not the servants of others. He would say, yeah, okay. But then he would say, but let's get to the point. And for him, the point was always, prove it to me that this would work as a policy or something like that. And I think this is one of the reasons why it took him a long time to understand how important it is also to advocate about political freedom. It's not that Friedman did not believe in political freedom, but if we think, for example, about the biggest stain in his reputation, the biggest stain in his career, which was his visit to Pinochet's Chile. Now, this is something that has been abused by the left. They've created a whole conspiracy theory. They're very unfair to Friedman. Friedman would actually travel anywhere they would invite him. Socialist Yugoslavia, he went to Soviet Union, to China multiple times, and he also went to Chile, and he gave his usual talk about inflation. But to him, he couldn't think that actually by going there, I'm sanctioning, as Ayn Rand would put it, I'm legitimizing, I'm giving my hand to shake the hand of a dictator, Pinochet, which is a hand which is full of blood. For Friedman, it was almost beneath him. Like, what are we guys talking about? This is like, we're not here to discuss abstract ideas. Later, he seemed to understand it a bit more, but I think his pragmatism is not to be, can actually help us understand this, in my view, big mistake he made by visiting Chile and legitimizing a thug like Pinochet.
Yes, I think the pragmatism, but also the amoralism. And pragmatism and amoralism often go together. So it might not seem like amoralism, but it is. If you say that everybody sort of deep down is motivated in the same way, and many economists say this, it's not only Friedman, everyone has the same basic motivation, then there's no difference between your neighbor and Hitler. It's like they have the same basic motivation. And maybe Hitler's going completely wrong in how he's trying to execute on it, but he has the same basic goals. And I mean, Hitler's the extreme, but you're bringing up like socialists, communists, like Pinochet. Everyone is basically motivated the same. So if I can just convince Pinochet that he's doing some things in execution wrong, that's what I do everywhere. So like, what's the difference between going here, going to? But it's not true that everybody's basically motivated in the same way. And if you thought that, then you have to think a lot about, well, what is this person's motivation? So there's a sanction involved, but what am I sanctioning? And if everybody's basically motivated in the same way, then I'm not sanctioning anything different if I deal with Pinochet or I deal with Reagan or it's all the same. But if you had a view, no, people's motivation differs greatly and can be like a little bad and completely evil and corrupt, then it would be much more of an issue of who am I dealing with? What is their motivation? And is it proper that I deal with them and in what way and so on? Those would be real questions. And I think part of what you're bringing up is they don't seem like real questions for Friedman. But if you take seriously his kind of viewpoint, they aren't real questions because everybody's basically the same. And I was going to say something about the bureaucrats. This applies more broadly for Ayn Rand in regard, say, to thinking about politicians. She, even at the level of bureaucrats and government officials, she does not think all of them are motivated in the same way. And in many essays, she makes a point that even an honest government official can't operate like an honest. If you take one of her real targets, antitrust laws, even if you're honest and think, oh yeah, what this is about protecting competition and so on, there's no way. It's a completely non-objective set of laws. It's impossible for it to be enforced properly, even if you're honest. But she knows full well not everyone in government's honest, but even the honest couldn't do this. The dishonest and the people who are after power and want to break companies that are successful because they're successful, the antitrust laws gives them a whole blank check on power to be able to go after companies like Microsoft and now Apple. And such laws will attract the person who has corrupt motivation. So the honest person will I don't know what to do with this. And the dishonest, corrupt person will, yeah, I want to be at the head of the antitrust division because now I can rule over companies. That's like a Linda Khan in today's world. And if you can make that distinction, that's a moral distinction of what's the motivation? And Ayn Rand's view wasn't every bureaucrat is evil, but there's a reason mixed economy attracts evil people. And so you see a growing evil if you look over decades in it. And that if you don't have these kinds of moral distinctions, which Friedman doesn't have, or you put it, I think, as snubbing kind of, and there's, you just blind yourself to reality when you do that.
Yeah, and later Friedman discovers public choice theory, which is actually developed by one of his, not really, but by Buchanan, who was close to who was something like a student of Friedman. And in Free to Choose, he makes the point that, look, everyone is motivated by self-interest. So if we have bad policies, the bureaucrat's self-interest will be to, let's say, get more money to his bureaucrat. So we're all self-interested. So let's make the right motive so that each one's self-interest leads towards a common, towards something like the common good. For people who lack the context, public choice theory makes the claim that politicians are not different than businessmen. The state also has the motive to, let's say, multiply its force and multiply its gains. So again, for Friedman, he doesn't understand what it means to be self-interest, and frankly, he's not that interested in understanding it. Now, going towards the end, it's time to juxtapose Friedman with Ayn Rand. On a personal level, or actually on a personal evaluation level, Ayn Rand was not a big fan of Friedman. Let's put it this way. And my suspicion is, Onkar, that this has to do not so much with his persona, because they didn't know each other well, as opposed, for example, she had a personal relationship with Mises, but not so much with Friedman. But she didn't like his approach. She didn't like his what we call his pragmatism. She didn't like his focus on economics, and actually she said that she holds it against him that that Friedman considers it something which is unnecessary to bring morality in economics. Actually, not only unnecessary, but impossible, or maybe even something which is unwanted.
Yeah, I think that's the essence of the issue. So, yes, she was highly critical of Friedman. She wouldn't watch Free to Choose, and was very derogatory towards it.
With some
And
colorful language, he had things to say about Friedman.
yeah, and if you think that what her stress is we need to rethink morality. One of the ways it's put into in Atlas Shrugged by the hero of the story, it's we don't need to return to morality, but to discover it. And if you think of Friedman at his best, it's just we need to return to morality. Like we just have to take utilitarianism more seriously or something like that. And then you would see the freedom. Like that's at his best. At his worst, but I think this is much more him going to his essence as a public intellectual, maybe not as a in his personal life, but as a public intellectual, it's we don't need morality. And that's the pragmatism and the amoralism. We just have to do what works and figure out what's efficient. Ayn Rand's view is the whole problem is we're in the grips of an evil morality. So like they have a radically different view of what the problem is. And so what the solution is, Ayn Rand's view, I think, of Friedman is that's a non-solution. You don't understand the problem, and you're just reinforcing the existing conventional morality that's evil. So you're just reinforcing the problem rather than solving it. But then I would put it, if you put it at a little more individual level, but still as public intellectuals, what Ayn Rand's doing, and I think what she sees herself, so she's consciously doing this, is I'm providing a pillar for capitalism and for freedom and for free markets that has not yet existed. I'm providing the morality that underpins a free society and the reason you would want a free society. So one way you can put it is the Declaration of Independence is saying we have the right to the pursuit of our own individual happiness. The moral question is it right to pursue your own happiness? Is it good? Is it moral to pursue your own happiness? Ayn Rand is the philosopher, and really the first philosopher, who answers yes and gives a detailed argument for why that's the right answer. And that's what was missing for the Founding Fathers, for America, for the case and defense, the case for and defense of freedom. That's what she's doing. And I think she expected other intellectuals, that is, contemporary intellectuals, to understand that that's what she was doing and to be appreciative and thank her for it. And when you have someone like a Friedman who is no, we don't need any of that, and we don't need to talk about morality. And when we talk about morality, we can just do it in conventional terms. It's from that perspective, he's turning his back on Ayn Rand's achievement and what is actually needed to fight for freedom. And turning his back, I think, is like, if you think of it in that way, it's, yeah. So I don't. You can put it. Friedman doesn't want anything to do with Ayn Rand. And then Ayn Rand's view is, okay, well, I don't want anything to do with you. And if you think of
Right.
the advocates of freedom, Ayn Rand recommended the free market economists, and particularly von Mises and some of his, you can think, students like Henry Hazlitt. Who of them recommends Ayn Rand? Nobody.
Right.
Not as, like, she recommends, if you want to learn free market economics, read von Mises. Who says, if you want to learn the free market philosophy, if you want to learn the justification and nature of freedom, rights, capitalism at a philosophical level, read Ayn Rand. Mises didn't do it. Hazlitt doesn't do it. Hayek doesn't do it. Friedman doesn't do it. They don't do it. And that, yeah, if you want to push back or disagree with that, but I think, like, that's part of how she's looking at it.
Right. Yeah. Now, to finish this episode, Onkar, we asked the question at the beginning: how do we change the world? And here is a possible objection by a well-meaning intellectual or political activist. So that person would say, look, Friedman did not manage to bring long-lasting change. The world today, in terms of the political climate, is way more hostile to the ideas of freedom than it was at the time of Friedman. So Friedman, in many quotes, failed. But Friedman gave us a small ask. He just said, let's change some economic policies that don't work towards policies that work and will make you richer. So this is something with the bar is relatively low for such a campaign. Ayn Rand is asking us something significantly more demanding. The bar with Ayn Rand is significantly higher. She's telling us you have to, if you want to fight for freedom, you have to radically attack the moral standards, and the things that you thought are good are actually not good. And if you want to fight for freedom, that's where you start for. So our friend, the young activist, will say, this sounds to me way more difficult. If Friedman, with his small ask, with his small challenge, with a short scale, with a small scale campaign and agenda failed, how will Ayn Rand, which is asking us something so grandiose, how can such a philosophy ever succeed?
I think at one level, yes, it is more difficult, but it, again, if the problem is we're in the grips of a wrong philosophical approach and a wrong moral approach, that the dominant philosophy and dominant morality are anti-reason, anti-reality, anti-life, which was Ayn Rand's view, then the only solution is you have to replace them. You have to dislodge them and put in their place something better. That is difficult, but it's the only solution. But to go back to some of what we were talking about before, it's not as though you do that and don't advocate for any reforms. You have to be doing both. And excuse me, if when you read Ayn Rand's work kind of chronologically, she was interested in politics, political activism, in the way that you were saying that Milton Friedman was. Now, Milton Friedman was more active with politicians and so on, but that's in part because he was conventional. So they were in part telling him things they wanted to hear. He was telling them things they wanted to hear. He wasn't challenging their moral notions. But Ayn Rand talked a lot about politics, about who to vote for. She had policy proposals. I brought up tax credits for education. She had other things in education proposals. So reforms, but with the goal that what we need is a long-term radical change in direction. philosophically and morally. And you can be working on both at the same time. And here, I think, particularly in the American context, the model is the abolitionist, so the fight against slavery. I think the best of them were simultaneously doing both. It's we've got a major problem that requires a revolution, not tinkering, not reforms, not we have to somehow slavery has to be more efficient. No, slavery is abomination, and it should be abolished from the land. That's what they're abolitionists. But I think the best of them were also interested in reforms. Anything that they thought of government procedures that could um, just stop the expansion of slavery. So is slavery in the new states joining the Union? Are they going to be slave states or not slave states? That was a major issue, and I think the best of them were fight. Well, look, it's better if slavery is not in the states that join. Even that's not an abolition yet, but it's a good reform. And if we shouldn't allow any more slave holding states to join the Union, like that is you can simultaneously advocate, and this is what I think the best of them were doing. Slavery should be abolished, but it certainly shouldn't be expanded. And you can think of that like that's a gradual step towards the abolishment. But they were clear it has to be abolished. It's an abomination. And so you can be doing both at the same time. And I think that's the way to think about a proper movement towards freedom. And if you're thinking of followers of Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivists, it's that we should be doing both. We're interested in the here and now and whatever actual positive reforms are possible. And we're interested in advocating for the revolutionary change in ideas that if we're going to stay long term on a path towards freedom, that change also has to happen.
So to sum up, the answer to the question, reform or evolution, is yes, both, but keeping in mind, A, where we want to go and what it will take to get there. What are the fights that are inevitable, and there is no shortcut to giving these fights to get there. A big thank you to Onkar, a big thank you to our viewers. This is a series of lectures that Yaron and Onkar gave many years ago, and at the moment it can be found in the Ayn Rand Institute's e-store. And the series is called Cultural Movements Creating Change. So turns out that we do have one resource of the topic. But at least in the time of New Idea Live, we haven't talked about Friedman. This was the first time. If you have suggestions about other prominent intellectuals, other prominent figures that you'd want us to cover, you can drop us an email at newideal@aynrand.org, newideal@aynrand.org. We will take your suggestions into considerations. So, Onkar, thank you. Many thanks to the audience for their time, and talk soon.